Before we begin, it's important to state that this video is for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are in distress or believe you may be a victim of abuse, please seek help from a qualified professional or contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The information presented here reflects historical contexts and should not be used to self-diagnose or diagnose others. Imagine for a moment that every time you state a fact, you're told you're misremembering. Every time you express a feeling, you're called too sensitive, too dramatic, or just plain crazy. Imagine your reality is slowly, methodically dismantled by the person who claims to love you most. Your successes are minimized, your failures are magnified, and your own thoughts begin to feel like a foreign country you can no longer navigate. This isn't a plot from a psychological thriller. For millions of Americans, this has been a quiet, suffocating reality. A prison without bars, a wound without a scar. And the most terrifying part? For most of American history, this experience didn't even have a name. It wasn't considered abuse. It was just life. It was marriage. It was family. It was normal. How is that possible? How could a form of cruelty so profound, so capable of shattering a person's soul, be completely invisible for centuries? That is the question we are going to answer. Over the next 10 parts, we are embarking on a journey through the untold history of mental and emotional abuse awareness in the United States. We will dig through dusty legal doctrines, forgotten medical texts, and the revolutionary ideas that finally gave a voice to this silent suffering. By the end of this series, you won't just understand terms like gaslighting or coercive control as modern buzzwords. You will understand the centuries of struggle it took for them to even exist. You will see how the fight for mental well-being is deeply intertwined with the fight for civil rights, for women's rights, and for basic human dignity. This is the story of how we learn to see the invisible. To find the beginning, we have to travel back to a time before the United States was even the United States. We have to look at the legal and cultural DNA inherited from Britain, specifically, a concept known as coverture. Now, coverture sounds like a quaint, old-fashioned term, but its implications were devastatingly total. The idea, codified by the English jurist William Blackstone, was simple. Upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was suspended. She became, in the eyes of the law, one entity with her husband, and that entity was him. Her property became his property. Her wages became his wages. She couldn't sign contracts, she couldn't sue someone in court, she couldn't write a will. She was, for all legal intents and purposes, a ghost. Now think about what that means for the concept of mental abuse. If a person has no independent legal identity, how can they possibly claim to have been mentally harmed? The very idea would have been nonsensical. To the colonial mind, it would be like a man's right hand suing his left. The system itself was a form of society-wide gaslighting. It sent an unmistakable message: your thoughts don't matter. Your feelings don't matter. Your inner world, your perspective, your reality, it is all subordinate to your husband's. He was the head of the household, the master of the domestic sphere. His word was law, his reality was the only reality. Any disagreement from his wife wasn't a difference of opinion. It was a form of rebellion, an unnatural disruption of the God-given order. This legal framework created a terrifyingly fertile ground for abuse to flourish, completely unchecked. A husband had the legal and social authority to control every aspect of his wife's life. He could dictate who she saw, where she went, what she did. He could isolate her from her friends and family, a tactic we now recognize as a hallmark of abuse, but which was then seen simply as a husband managing his household. He could belittle her, criticize her, and humiliate her, and society would see it as him simply correcting his wife's faults, performing his duty to guide her. There was no vocabulary, no legal or social framework to define his behavior as harmful. In fact, it was often seen as necessary. This power dynamic was so absolute that it even extended to physical violence. You've probably heard of the phrase rule of thumb. The popular myth is that it comes from an Old English law allowing a man to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. While the direct historical link for that specific rule is debated by historians, the underlying principle is chillingly accurate. Early American law, borrowing from English common law, recognized a husband's right to chastise his wife. This was the right of moderate correction. Of course, what constituted moderate was left entirely up to the husband and the patriarchal society that supported him. In 1782, A court in Mississippi declared that a husband had the right to beat his wife with a whip or a stick, as long as he didn't cause great bodily harm. Think about that. The law was not concerned with whether he hit her, but only with how badly he injured her. If the bar for recognizing physical abuse was that high, requiring broken bones or life-threatening injury to even be considered a problem, then the concept of mental or emotional harm was in a completely different galaxy. It was literally unthinkable. The mind was not a place the law could or would venture. A woman's spirit could be systematically crushed, her confidence annihilated, her sense of self erased, and the law would have absolutely nothing to say about it. She was, after all, his property. And this wasn't just a legal abstraction. It shaped the everyday reality for millions of women. It was preached from the pulpit, printed in pamphlets, and reinforced in every social interaction. A good wife was an obedient wife. A troublesome wife was one who had her own opinions, her own desires, her own sense of self. Women who dared to speak out, who complained of mistreatment, were often seen as the problem themselves. They were labeled shrews, scolds, or hysterics. Instead of their husbands being condemned for cruelty, they were condemned for failing to be submissive. The system wasn't just blind to their suffering. It actively blamed them for it. This was the foundation. An America built on a legal and cultural framework where, for half the population, the self was legally erased. But even in the deepest darkness, cracks of light begin to appear. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, new ideas began to stir. The revolutionary spirit that had birthed the nation, ideas of individual liberty and inalienable rights, started to be applied in ways the Founding Fathers never intended. The first whispers of the women's suffrage movement began to question the very foundations of coverture. At the same time, a new and mysterious field of study was emerging, one that dared to map the unseen territories of the human mind, psychology. For the first time, society was beginning to consider that the mind was a real place, a place that could be explored, understood, and even wounded. The battle to recognize the invisible injuries of mental abuse hadn't yet begun, but the intellectual weapons for that fight were just starting to be forged. The fight for the mind was about to begin, and it started in the most unlikely of places, the asylum. The asylum of the early 19th century was not a place of healing. It was a warehouse for the unwanted, a place where society's frayed edges were tucked away, out of sight and out of mind. To be declared insane was to be stripped of your humanity. You weren't a patient, you were a problem. You weren't sick. You were a monster or an animal or a sinner possessed by demons. And you were treated as such. The so-called treatments were instruments of torture disguised as medicine. People were bled, purged, and blistered to rebalance their humors. They were strapped into tranquilizing chairs for days on end, hooded and bound. They were submerged in ice-cold baths until they nearly drowned. A shock to the system meant to jolt them back to sanity. More often, they were simply forgotten, left in unheated cellars, naked, chained to walls, living in their own filth. They were beaten by their keepers, starved, and left to rot. This was not a secret. It was simply a reality that no one with power had the will to confront. The suffering was invisible because society chose not to look. And then one person did. Her name was Dorothea Dix. And in 1841, she was a 39-year-old schoolteacher, a writer of children's books, and a woman in frail health. She was not a doctor, a politician, or a revolutionary, but she possessed something far more potent, a conscience that could not be quieted. Her journey began on a cold March day when she volunteered to teach a Sunday school class to female inmates at the East Cambridge Jail in Massachusetts. In the jail's cellar, she found the insane. They weren't criminals, but they were housed in the same squalor. They were locked in a dark, foul-smelling, unheated space. When Dix asked the jailer why there was no heat, he replied simply that the insane do not feel the cold. That single, breathtakingly cruel statement lit a fire in her. She saw not monsters but human beings, shivering in the dark, stripped of every shred of dignity. And she decided in that moment that if no one else would be their voice, she would. What followed was one of the most remarkable crusades in American history. Dorothea Dix embarked on a 2-year, systematic investigation of every jail, almshouse, and prison in Massachusetts. She traveled thousands of miles by carriage, by train, and on foot. She was methodical, meticulous, and fearless. She stepped into the filth and the despair, notebook in hand. She documented every horror. The cages, the chains, the beatings, the sexual abuse of female patients by their male keepers. She recorded the stories of people who had been locked away for years, forgotten by their families and the world. For 2 years she gathered this mountain of evidence, this testament to human cruelty born from ignorance and apathy. Then, in 1843, she was ready to go to war. She presented her findings to the Massachusetts state legislature in a document that would become legendary, the Memorial. Her words were a thunderclap in the halls of power. She wrote, "I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. I come to place before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, the outcast. I come as the advocate of the helpless, the forgotten, the insane." She didn't just present data. She told stories. She described a man in Danvers confined in a cage, in which he stood upright. He was naked. She told of a woman in Worcester chained, beaten with a rod. She forced the powerful men of the legislature to see what she had seen, to smell the stench of neglect, to hear the clanking of chains. The reaction was explosive. Many legislators were shocked and horrified. Others were dismissive, accusing her of exaggeration, of being a meddling, hysterical woman. But Dix was relentless. She had the facts. She had the names, the dates, the locations. She had the truth. And she used it like a weapon. She lobbied politicians, wrote editorials, and rallied public support. And she won. The Massachusetts legislature, shamed into action, passed a bill to expand the state's mental hospital in Worcester, providing humane care for the indigent insane. For most people, this would have been a life's defining achievement. For Dorothea Dix, it was just the beginning. She took her crusade national. From New Jersey to North Carolina, from Illinois to Mississippi, she repeated the same pattern. Investigate, document, expose, and lobby. State by state, she shamed legislatures into building and funding asylums dedicated to what was then a revolutionary concept, moral treatment. This was the belief that mental illness was a disease, not a moral failing, and that it could be treated with kindness, clean living, and purposeful work, rather than with chains and beatings. She was directly responsible for the founding of more than 30 hospitals across the United States, and even in Europe. Her ultimate goal, however, was even grander. She believed the care of the mentally ill was a national responsibility. She spent years lobbying Congress to pass a bill that would set aside millions of acres of federal land, with the revenue from its sale used to fund mental asylums across the nation. It was a visionary piece of social welfare legislation, decades ahead of its time. And in 1854, after years of tireless effort, she succeeded. The bill for the benefit of the indigent insane passed both the House and the Senate. Victory was at hand. And then it was all undone with the stroke of a pen. President Franklin Pierce, a staunch defender of states' rights, vetoed the bill. He argued that the federal government had no constitutional authority to be involved in social welfare. He wrote, "If Congress has power to make provision for the indigent insane, it has the same power to provide for the indigent who are not insane." He feared it would open the door to a federal government that took care of all the poor, a prospect he found unthinkable. The veto was a crushing defeat for Dix. But her work had already changed America. The true legacy of Dorothea Dix wasn't just the brick and mortar of the hospitals she built. It was the radical idea she planted in the American consciousness, that a person's mental state mattered, that psychological suffering was real suffering, that a mind could be injured just as surely as a body, and that those with such injuries deserved compassion, not condemnation. She didn't have the language of psychology or the framework of mental abuse as we know it today. But her crusade was the essential first step. Before you can identify the subtle violence of emotional abuse, you must first accept that the mind itself is a realm where real violence can occur. Dix forced a nation to stop looking at the mentally ill as objects to be controlled, and to start seeing them as subjects of their own profound, internal experience. She built the shelters, but the work of understanding what was happening inside the minds of those who lived there was just getting started. The walls of the new asylums were meant to protect the vulnerable, to provide a sanctuary for moral treatment. But a humane cage is still a cage. And what doctors were about to discover was that the most profound injuries weren't always visible in chains or bruises. They were hidden deep within the psyche. A new science was emerging, one that promised to map this uncharted territory. And a Viennese doctor with a controversial theory about the unconscious mind was about to give a name to the ghosts that haunted these new hallways. His name was Sigmund Freud, and the ghosts he sought to name weren't supernatural. They were memories locked away in a part of the mind he called the unconscious. Before Freud, if a person, almost always a woman, suffered from anxiety, paralysis, or fits of terror with no discernible physical cause, she was diagnosed with hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek for uterus, because for centuries, the accepted medical wisdom was that a woman's emotional suffering was caused by a wandering womb. The cures were just as absurd. Smelling salts, bizarre water therapies, sometimes even institutionalization. The message was clear. Your suffering is not real. It is a flaw in your biology, a failure of your womanhood. Freud proposed something radically different. He suggested that these physical symptoms were not random malfunctions, but a language. A desperate, coded language of the mind. He believed the body was acting out a story the conscious mind refused to remember. A trauma so profound it had been buried alive. And he believed that if you could just get the person to talk, to excavate that memory piece by piece, the symptoms would vanish. He called it the talking cure. And it was the birth of psychotherapy. Imagine the sheer, earth-shattering power of that idea in the late 1800s. For the first time, a respected physician was looking at a traumatized person and saying, "Your pain is real. It has a source. And the key to healing is hidden inside your own story." He sat with his patients for hours, listening as they unspooled the narratives of their lives. And as he listened, a terrifying pattern began to emerge, one that appeared again and again in the stories of his female patients. He heard tales of childhood, not of innocent play but of violation, of abuse at the hands of fathers, uncles, and trusted family friends. Based on this overwhelming evidence, Freud formulated a bold, and in his world heretical theory. He called it the seduction theory. In 1896, he stood before the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna and declared that the root cause of hysteria was, in nearly all cases, sexual abuse experienced in childhood. He was, for a brief, shining moment, the ultimate champion of the abused. He was the one man with the credibility and the platform to tell the world that the crazy women in their asylums and drawing rooms weren't crazy at all. They were survivors. He was holding a mirror up to the respectable face of Victorian society and revealing the monstrous secrets it kept hidden behind closed doors. And society stared back, horrified. The backlash was immediate and brutal. His colleagues called him a degenerate, a fantasist. They ostracized him. To accept Freud's theory was to accept that the pillars of their society, the respectable patriarchs, the educated gentlemen, were capable of monstrous acts. It was an idea so destabilizing, so threatening to the established order, that it simply could not be true. The professional pressure mounted. His reputation was on the line, and Freud found himself at a crossroads. He could stand by his patients, stand by the truth he had uncovered, and face professional ruin. Or he could find another explanation. He chose another explanation. In one of the most tragic and consequential reversals in the history of psychology, Freud abandoned the seduction theory. He threw it away, and he replaced it with something far more palatable to his colleagues, and far more devastating for victims of abuse. He declared that his patients had been lying. Not consciously, of course, but he argued that these stories of abuse were not memories of real events. They were fantasies. They were the repressed, incestuous desires of the child, projected onto the parent. He called it the Oedipus complex. Let the weight of that sink in. He took the genuine trauma of survivors, the stories they had bravely shared with him, and rebranded it as their own twisted, infantile desire. The abuser was absolved. The victim was now the one with the sick, perverted mind. The message shifted from, "Something terrible was done to you," to, "There is something terrible inside of you." This single act of intellectual and moral cowardice poisoned the well of psychotherapy for nearly a century. It institutionalized victim blaming at the very foundation of the field. For decades to come, if a patient, especially a woman or a child, tried to speak about abuse, the Freudian-trained therapist was conditioned to hear it not as a cry for help, but as evidence of a deep-seated neurosis, a fantasy that needed to be analyzed away. The door that had been cracked open, offering a sliver of light and validation, was slammed shut and locked. The burden of proof was placed squarely, and impossibly, on the shoulders of the abused. Their own minds were turned into a witness against them. This new Freudian psychology began to cross the Atlantic, seeping into the consciousness of American medicine and culture. It offered a sophisticated intellectual framework for understanding the human mind, but it carried within it a dangerous virus: the inherent dismissal of a victim's reality. The idea that trauma was something you imagined, not something you endured, became a powerful tool for maintaining the status quo. It was easier to diagnose a child with a complex than to confront a predator in the home. It was cleaner to analyze a woman's neuroses than to accept the brutal reality of domestic violence. The focus shifted from the external act of abuse to the internal landscape of the victim. The question was no longer what happened to you, but what's wrong with you? This fundamental misdirection sent countless people down a rabbit hole of self-blame and confusion, trying to cure a sickness they didn't have, while their actual wounds were ignored, left to fester in the dark. The ghosts in the hallways of the asylums were given a new clinical name, but they weren't exorcised. They were simply told they weren't real. But while the intellectual elites in New York and Boston were debating the nuances of the ID and the ego, a far more direct and far more brutal approach to mending the mind was gaining terrifying momentum. If the mind was a machine that had gone haywire, some believed it couldn't be fixed by simply talking. It needed a physical repair, a hands-on intervention, and in the hushed, sterile operating theaters of American hospitals, a new kind of cure was being perfected, one that didn't just silence the ghosts of trauma, but sought to carve them directly out of the brain itself. The procedure was called the lobotomy, and to its proponents it wasn't butchery, it was a miracle, a swift, decisive severing of the brain's troublesome circuits. The idea, born in Portugal, landed on American shores with the force of a revelation. In a world of overcrowded asylums filled with the desperate and the disturbed, here was a final solution. A way to calm the agitated, to soothe the violent, to quiet the voices that screamed in the dark. Promised peace. But the peace it delivered was the chilling, vacant peace of a hollowed-out shell. And no one in America championed this peace more fervently, more theatrically, than a neurologist named Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman wasn't just a doctor. He was a showman, a crusader on a mission from what he saw as medical enlightenment. He saw the state of mental institutions, the filth, the neglect, the human suffering warehoused and forgotten, and he believed he had the key, not just to manage the symptoms but to eliminate them. He envisioned a world where the most difficult patients could be rendered placid, manageable, and even sent home. His initial method was brutal enough, requiring drilling holes into the patient's skull. But it was slow. It was messy. It required an operating room and a surgeon. It wasn't efficient enough for the scale of the problem as Freeman saw it. He wanted to take his cure to the masses. He needed something faster, cheaper, and more portable. And so, in a moment of what can only be described as grotesque inspiration, he found his tool in the most mundane of places, his kitchen drawer. An ice pick. This was the birth of the transorbital lobotomy. The ice pick lobotomy. It sounds like something from a horror film because it was. The procedure was terrifying in its simplicity. The patient would often be rendered unconscious with a jolt of electroshock. Then Freeman would take his instrument, a long, sharp steel pick called a lookatome, modeled after that ice pick, and insert it into the corner of the patient's eye socket, between the eyeball and the eyelid. With a mallet, a common surgical hammer, he would tap it through the thin layer of bone at the back of the socket and into the frontal lobes of the brain. Once inside, he would swish the pick back and forth, severing the connections that govern personality, emotion, and executive function, the very fibers of the self. Then he would pull it out and do the exact same thing on the other side. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Freeman became a traveling salesman of brain surgery, driving his van, which he called his lobotomobile, from one state asylum to the next. He performed thousands of these procedures, often in front of audiences of doctors and nurses, a macabre performance of medical hubris. He was so confident, so cavalier, that he developed a technique for doing both eye sockets at once, a lookatome in each hand. Who were his patients? They were the forgotten, the schizophrenics, the severely depressed. But they were also so many others. They were veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD. They were people with chronic headaches. And most chillingly, they were women. Disproportionately, they were women. Women diagnosed with agitation, neurosis, or anxiety. Women who were defiant, difficult, or simply didn't conform to the quiet, subservient role society demanded of them. For these women, the lobotomy wasn't a cure for a disease. It was a punishment for their personality. It was the ultimate tool of social and domestic control, disguised as medicine. A husband, a father, a brother could have a troublesome woman silenced forever, with the full blessing of the medical establishment. It was mental abuse taken to its most horrific physical conclusion. And perhaps no story illustrates this better than the most famous and most tragic of Walter Freeman's patients. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy. She was the third child of the burgeoning Kennedy dynasty, the sister of a future president, of future senators. But from a young age, Rosemary was different. She struggled in school. She was prone to mood swings and outbursts. In the hyper-competitive, image-obsessed world of the Kennedys, Rosemary was a liability. Her father, Joe Kennedy, was terrified that her behavior, her intellectual disabilities, and her increasingly rebellious teenage spirit would cause a scandal that could derail his son's political ambitions. He worried she might get pregnant or simply embarrass the family in some public way. Her struggles were a family secret, a source of private shame. Today, we might look at her behavior and see a young woman with a learning disability, struggling under immense pressure to keep up with her brilliant siblings, acting out in ways that are hardly uncommon for a teenager. But in 1941, her father saw only a problem that needed to be fixed. He heard about a new miracle surgery, a surgery that promised to calm his daughter, to make her more docile, more agreeable. He turned to Dr. Walter Freeman. Without his wife's knowledge, Joe Kennedy arranged for his 23-year-old daughter to be lobotomized. Rosemary was awake for the procedure. They asked her to sing songs and tell stories so they could gauge how far to cut. They kept cutting until she fell silent. And when the ice pick was removed, the vibrant, difficult, beautiful young woman named Rosemary Kennedy was gone forever. The surgery was a catastrophe. It left her with the mental capacity of a toddler. She was unable to walk or speak coherently. She was incontinent. The Kennedy family's problem was solved. Rosemary was no longer a threat to their reputation. They sent her away to an institution, and for decades they essentially erased her from the family history. Her siblings were told she was unavailable, that she was teaching at a school in the Midwest. Many of them didn't learn the truth for 20 years. Rosemary Kennedy, a victim of her family's ambition and a doctor's God complex, lived out the rest of her long life hidden away from the world that had been promised to her, silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her story is the ultimate example of what the lobotomy truly was. It wasn't a cure. It was an erasure, a way to dispose of inconvenient people. It severed their connection to their own minds, turning them into ghosts in their own bodies. It took the complexities of human suffering, the trauma, the abuse, the chemical imbalances, the societal pressures, and reduced them to a simple wiring problem that could be fixed with a hammer and a pick. It was the peak of a medical philosophy that saw the mind not as something to be understood, but as a machine to be controlled. Thousands upon thousands of Americans had their personalities, their very souls, carved out of them in this way. The practice was celebrated, winning its inventor a Nobel Prize. But as the years passed, the horrifying results could no longer be ignored. The legions of listless, apathetic, and emotionally blunted patients shuffling through hospital wards were a testament to the procedure's devastating failure. The medical community began to turn against Freeman and his ice pick. A new era was dawning, one that promised a different kind of miracle. A cure that was just as revolutionary but far less bloody. A solution that you could swallow. The age of the scalpel was about to give way to the age of the pill. This new miracle didn't come from a surgeon's toolbox, but from a French chemistry lab. In the early 1950s, a pharmaceutical company was trying to develop a better anesthetic. They created a compound called chlorpromazine. It was a decent sedative, but a surgeon noticed something strange. Patients given the drug before surgery weren't just calm, they were detached, indifferent. A profound sense of tranquility washed over them, a chemical peace that seemed to uncouple them from their anxieties. The surgeon wondered, if this could calm a patient facing a scalpel, what could it do for a mind at war with itself? The question made its way to psychiatrists, and the results were almost biblical in their impact. In asylums where the air was thick with screams and the metallic tang of fear, a new sound began to emerge: silence. Patients who had been locked in catatonic states for years began to speak. Those lost to violent, paranoid delusions became placid, reachable. It wasn't a cure, not in the way an antibiotic cures an infection. It was a management tool of unprecedented power. The drug, marketed in the United States as Thorazine, was nicknamed liquid lobotomy. It achieved the same goal, a compliant, manageable patient, but without the blood, the ice pick, or the irreversible brain damage. Or so they thought. This was the birth of the psychopharmacological revolution. For the first time, mental illness seemed like a problem that could be solved chemically. It fit perfectly into the post-war American ethos of scientific progress and quick fixes. We had split the atom, we were about to go to the moon. Surely we could conquer the chaos of the human mind with a pill. Pharmaceutical companies, smelling a gold rush, poured millions into research. Soon, a whole arsenal of major tranquilizers, or antipsychotics, hit the market. This chemical revolution fueled a social one. For decades, reformers had decried the horrific conditions of state asylums. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and often little more than human warehouses. Now, with drugs like Thorazine, there was a compelling argument to be made. Why keep these people locked away? If their most disruptive symptoms could be controlled with medication, couldn't they live in the community? It was a beautiful, humane idea. It was called deinstitutionalization. President John F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary had been a victim of a disastrous lobotomy, championed the cause. In 1963, he signed the Community Mental Health Act, a landmark piece of legislation designed to replace massive state institutions with a network of local, accessible care centers. The plan was to empty the asylums and welcome their residents back into society. The doors of the institutions began to swing open. Between the mid-1950s and the 1990s, the number of patients in public mental hospitals in the U.S. plummeted by over 90%. It was hailed as a victory for civil rights, the liberation of a forgotten population. But a dark irony was at play. We weren't freeing people. In many cases, we were just changing the nature of their prison. The promise of robust community mental health centers largely went unfulfilled. Funding dried up. Political will evaporated. Patients were discharged from hospitals with a bottle of pills and a bus ticket, sent out into a world that wasn't ready for them and didn't want them. They were freed from the asylum's walls only to be imprisoned by poverty, homelessness, and the isolating stigma of their illness. The chemical miracle had a devastatingly cruel side effect. And what about the drugs themselves? While they could quiet a storm in the mind, they often did so by creating a permanent fog. Patients on high doses of early antipsychotics developed a distinctive shuffling gait, the Thorazine shuffle. They experienced a profound emotional blunting, a loss of will and personality. And then there was tardive dyskinesia, a horrifying, often irreversible neurological disorder causing uncontrollable facial tics, grimaces, and tongue protrusions. The very drugs meant to restore a person's dignity were stripping it away in a new insidious fashion. The physical straitjacket was gone, replaced by a chemical one. It was a quieter, more subtle form of control, but it was control all the same. The abuse was no longer about physical restraint. It was about the systematic dulling of the human spirit. But the revolution was just getting started. The success of Thorazine proved there was a massive untapped market for mind-altering drugs. And if a pill could manage the severe terrors of psychosis, what could it do for the quieter anxieties of everyday life? The focus of the pharmaceutical industry began to shift from the asylum to the suburbs. In 1955, a new drug hit the market. It was called meprobamate, but everyone came to know it by its trade name, Miltown. Miltown was a minor tranquilizer, designed not for psychosis but for anxiety, and it became an absolute sensation. Suddenly, the pressures of modern life, the stress of a corporate job, the ennui of a suburban housewife, the general hum of post-war anxiety, were not just feelings to be endured. They were symptoms of a medical condition, and there was a prescription for it. Miltown was marketed as the ultimate quick fix. It was the happy pill. Hollywood stars gushed about it. People hosted Miltown parties. It became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of a new medicated American dream. You didn't have to struggle with your feelings. You could simply swallow them. This was a profound shift. Mental health care was no longer just for the insane. It was for everyone. The line between profound mental illness and ordinary human suffering was beginning to blur, and a multi-billion-dollar industry was rising up to profit from that ambiguity. This created an entirely new dynamic of potential abuse. It wasn't the overt cruelty of the asylum. It was something far more subtle. It was the power of a doctor to tell a patient, "Your sadness isn't valid. Your anxiety isn't a rational response to your circumstances. It's a chemical imbalance. Here, take this." It was the power to redefine normal human emotion as pathology. The message was clear. If you are unhappy, you are broken. And we have the pill to fix you. This new medical model was seductive because it was simple. It removed the need for messy, complicated introspection. It absolved society of its role in creating stress and despair. The problem wasn't your dead-end job, your unhappy marriage, or the crushing weight of social expectations. The problem was in your brain chemistry. And the solution came from a pharmacy. The age of the pill had not only changed how we treated mental illness, it was beginning to change what we considered mental illness to be. The power to define sickness and health was being consolidated, not just in the hands of doctors, but in the boardrooms of pharmaceutical companies and the committees that would soon begin writing the new Bible of psychiatry. The very language we use to describe our inner lives was about to be rewritten, creating a system so powerful and so persuasive that questioning it would become a diagnosis in itself. The year is 1974. The man at the center of this seismic shift is not a household name. He isn't the president of the American Psychiatric Association or a celebrated public intellectual. His name is Robert Spitzer, a researcher at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And he is a man obsessed with a single powerful idea: reliability. In the world of 1970s psychiatry, reliability was a joke. The field was a chaotic landscape of competing theories, mostly dominated by psychoanalysis. A diagnosis depended more on which psychiatrist you saw than on what was actually wrong with you. One doctor might diagnose a patient with an anxiety neurosis, rooted in a supposed childhood conflict. Another, looking at the exact same patient, might see a schizoid personality. It was subjective, impressionistic, and to outsiders it looked less like medicine and more like literary criticism. This wasn't just an academic problem. It was a crisis of legitimacy. How could psychiatry be taken seriously by other medical fields, by insurance companies, by the government, if its own practitioners couldn't agree on the most basic diagnoses? The entire profession was at risk of being dismissed as elaborate guesswork. Spitzer saw this weakness, this chaos, and understood that it was also an opportunity. He was a data guy, a numbers man. He believed in evidence, in observation, in clear, unambiguous definitions. He looked at the Freudian establishment, with its unprovable theories about the ID and the ego, and saw a system ripe for revolution. His weapon of choice wasn't a scalpel or a new therapy. It was a checklist. The idea was deceptively simple, yet it would tear the profession apart. Spitzer proposed that psychiatric disorders should be defined not by their presumed, invisible causes, but by their visible, countable symptoms. It was a radical departure. No more digging into the murky depths of the subconscious. Instead, a psychiatrist would become a meticulous observer, a detective of behavior. Does the patient have a depressed mood? Check. Do they have diminished interest or pleasure? Check. Insomnia? Weight loss? Fatigue? Check, check, check. If a patient ticked enough boxes on the list, they had the disorder. It was clear, it was definable, and most importantly, it was reliable. Two different doctors using the same checklist on the same patient should, in theory, arrive at the same diagnosis. To the psychoanalytic old guard, this was heresy. It was an assault on the very soul of their profession. They accused Spitzer and his allies of creating a cookbook psychiatry, of reducing the profound, complex tapestry of a human life to a sterile, soulless list of symptoms. They argued that this new system ignored the why. It didn't care about the patient's story, their relationships, their trauma, their unique inner world. It only cared about the what. A person wasn't suffering from the lingering pain of a neglectful childhood anymore. They were suffering from dysthymic disorder, code 300.40. The human being was being replaced by a data point. But Spitzer had the momentum. The profession was desperate for scientific credibility, and his model offered a clear path to achieving it. As the head of the task force to create the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-3, he assembled his committees. These meetings, held in hotel conference rooms throughout the late 1970s, were not quiet, scholarly affairs. They were battlegrounds. Psychiatrists would argue, debate, and shout for hours, not over complex theories but over words. Should the criteria for depression include irritability? Or would that cast the net too wide? How many symptoms should be required for a diagnosis of schizophrenia? 3, 4, 5? Entire human conditions were being defined, medicalized, and legitimized, not through laboratory discovery, but through a process of negotiation and consensus. It was a political process as much as a scientific one. And new illnesses were being born. Before the DSM-3, for instance, there was no formal diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. Vietnam veterans, struggling with the horrific aftermath of the war, were often dismissed as having character flaws or personality disorders. But by applying Spitzer's symptom-based model, advocates were able to create a checklist of nightmares, flashbacks, and hypervigilance, and in doing so, they forced the psychiatric establishment to recognize their suffering as a legitimate medical condition. PTSD was officially voted into existence. On the other hand, conditions that had been in the manual for years were voted out. Just before this process began, Spitzer had been instrumental in the fight to remove homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM-2. a landmark victory for gay rights, achieved not by scientific discovery, but by activism and a political vote within the APA. This new system was powerful. It gave psychiatrists a common language. It gave researchers a way to conduct standardized studies. And crucially, it gave insurance companies something they could understand and, more importantly, something they could bill for. You could now bill for treating generalized anxiety disorder, code 300.02. It was clean, efficient, and medical. But in this rush for clarity and legitimacy, a profound and dangerous trade-off was being made, one that would have devastating consequences for victims of abuse. The DSM-3 model, by its very design, is decontextualized. It actively separates symptoms from their source. It doesn't ask why you have insomnia, anxiety, and a sense of worthlessness. It simply notes that you do and gives it a label. Think about what this means for someone in an emotionally abusive relationship. The constant gaslighting, the criticism, the isolation. It's designed to create anxiety, depression, and a shattered sense of self. Under the old psychoanalytic model, a therapist might have spent years exploring the dynamics of that relationship, identifying the abuse as the source of the patient's pain. But under the new DSM-3 model, the abuser disappears from the diagnostic picture. The focus shifts entirely inward onto the victim. Their valid, understandable reactions to an insane and painful environment are reframed as a malfunction within their own brain. The problem is no longer the abuse. The problem is their major depressive disorder or their panic disorder. The abuser is rendered invisible, and the victim is handed a diagnosis. Their suffering is pathologized. The cause is ignored, and the symptoms are targeted, often with medication. This was a gift to the pharmaceutical industry. Before, how do you create a pill for a neurotic conflict with one's mother? You can't. But how do you create a pill for a checklist of symptoms called social phobia? That you can do. The DSM-3 didn't just rewrite the language of psychiatry. It created the very market conditions for the explosion of psychotropic drugs that would define the coming decades. In 1980, the DSM-3 was published. It was a thick blue book, and it was an immediate runaway success. It sold over 1 million copies. It became the undisputed Bible of mental health, not just in the United States, but around the world. Medical schools redesigned their curricula around it. Hospitals and clinics adopted it as the standard of care. Robert Spitzer and his task force had won. They had dragged psychiatry, kicking and screaming, into the modern medical world. They had given it a language of science and a veneer of certainty. But in their quest to map the landscape of the mind, they had drawn a map that left out the most important features: the people, the places, and the experiences that cause our deepest wounds. The revolution was complete. Psychiatry had found its footing as a legitimate science. But in doing so, it had created a perfect system for identifying sickness and a tragically flawed system for understanding suffering. And the age of the checklist had just begun. The age of the checklist was ushered in by a book. A book that would become, for better or worse, the Bible of American psychiatry. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-3, and it changed everything. Before the DSM-3, diagnosis was a messy, subjective affair, dominated by psychoanalytic theories about childhood conflicts and subconscious desires. Two different psychiatrists could look at the same patient and come up with two wildly different conclusions. There was no common language. Insurance companies were reluctant to pay for treatments based on what felt like Freudian guesswork. The field of psychiatry was having an identity crisis. It desperately wanted to be taken seriously, to be seen as a hard science just like cardiology or oncology. The DSM-3 was the answer. It was a revolution in objectivity. It threw out the abstract theories and focused on one thing: observable symptoms. It was a cookbook for the mind. If a patient presents with 5 or more symptoms from a specific list, for a duration of at least 2 weeks, they have major depressive disorder. If they exhibit a different set of behaviors, they have generalized anxiety disorder. It was clear, it was concise, it was reliable. Any two doctors using the manual would likely arrive at the same diagnosis. It was a triumph of medical classification. Insurance companies loved it. Pharmaceutical companies loved it. It created a neat and tidy system where human suffering could be categorized, coded, and most importantly, billed for. But in this relentless pursuit of scientific legitimacy, something vital was lost: context. The DSM-3 created a system that was brilliant at answering the question what, but terrible at asking the question why. The checklist doesn't have a box for Is your spouse systematically isolating you from your friends and family? It doesn't have a diagnostic code for, does your partner control all the finances and mock your intelligence until you question your own sanity? No, the checklist simply asks, are you feeling worthless? Do you have trouble sleeping? Have you lost interest in things you once enjoyed? And so, a victim of relentless psychological abuse walks into a doctor's office. They describe their profound sadness, their constant anxiety, their feeling of being trapped in a fog. The doctor, following the new gold standard, consults the manual, checks the boxes, and declares, you have depression. The problem is now located squarely inside the victim's head. It's a chemical imbalance, a faulty neural pathway. The diagnosis pathologizes the victim's reaction to an insane situation, rather than identifying the insane situation itself. The victim gets a label and a prescription for Prozac which had just hit the market. The abuser, who caused the symptoms, remains invisible to the medical system. They don't have a diagnosis. They're just a contributing factor, an environmental stressor, as relevant to the final diagnosis as the weather. This move toward a decontextualized biological model of mental illness was happening at the exact same moment that a powerful social movement was screaming that context was everything. Second-wave feminism in the 1970s and 80s was tearing the lid off the private domestic sphere. Activists were establishing the nation's first domestic violence shelters. They were creating hotlines. They were shouting from the streets and from the halls of Congress that the home was not a safe haven for millions of women. It was a site of terror, control, and violence. They weren't talking about chemical imbalances, they were talking about power imbalances. They were talking about the systematic psychological destruction that happened behind closed doors. While institutional psychiatry was busy creating labels for the victims, these activists and a handful of pioneering psychologists were trying to create a language for the abuse itself. One of the most powerful concepts to emerge from this era was battered woman syndrome, a term coined by psychologist Dr. Lenore Walker in the late 1970s. Walker's research wasn't about creating another checklist of symptoms. It was about describing a process. She identified the insidious cyclical nature of abuse, a repeating pattern of tension building, followed by an acute abusive incident, followed by a period of reconciliation or a honeymoon phase, where the abuser is apologetic and loving, promising it will never happen again. This cycle, she argued, creates a state of learned helplessness, a psychological trap that makes it incredibly difficult for a victim to leave. Battered woman syndrome was a radical idea. It reframed the question from why doesn't she just leave, to what has been done to her that makes leaving feel impossible. It gave a name to the psychological effects of living in a state of chronic fear and control. It was a direct challenge to the medical model's obsession with what was happening inside the individual's skull, and instead focused on what was happening inside the individual's life. It was a concept born from listening to survivors, not from a committee meeting. It became a crucial tool, not in the psychiatrist's office, but in the courtroom, where it was used to help explain to juries why a woman who had been abused for years might finally resort to violence to save her own life. Yet, establishment psychiatry largely met these ideas with a shrug. Battered woman syndrome never made it into the DSM as a formal diagnosis. It was seen as too political, too sociological, too messy. It didn't fit the neat biological boxes. There was, however, one major breakthrough in the DSM-3 that did acknowledge the power of external events to shape the mind. It was the inclusion, for the first time, of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This diagnosis was born from the ashes of the Vietnam War. Doctors and advocates fought tirelessly to get the psychiatric establishment to recognize that the horror of combat could leave a lasting, debilitating scar on the psyche. The flashbacks, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, these weren't signs of a pre-existing weakness. They were the normal reactions of a human nervous system to an abnormal event. The inclusion of PTSD was a monumental step forward. It was the first official admission in the psychiatric Bible that the outside world could break the inside world. It created a framework for understanding trauma. But the definition was narrow. It was built around a specific type of trauma, a singular life-threatening event, a firefight, a car crash, a natural disaster. It was designed to diagnose the wound from a catastrophic explosion. It was far less equipped to recognize the slow, grinding erosion of the self that came from years of psychological abuse. It struggled to account for trauma that didn't come with a bang, but with a whisper. The daily drip of criticism, the constant gaslighting, the methodical isolation. The system could finally see the soldier haunted by the war, but it remained blind to the spouse haunted by the marriage. A language for trauma now existed, but it was a language of shock and awe, not of slow-motion terror. The world could finally diagnose the wound from a single bullet, but it still had no name for the death by 1,000 cuts. And so, the stage was set for the next great battle in understanding the mind. This battle wouldn't be fought in the trenches of a foreign war, but in the kitchens, living rooms, and bedrooms of America. It would be waged not against an external enemy, but against an internal one, the deeply entrenched idea that a family's home was a sovereign nation, its doors closed to the world, its suffering a private, shameful secret. For centuries, the home was sold as a sanctuary, but for millions, it was a silent battlefield where the wounds were invisible and the screams were never heard. The 1,000 cuts were inflicted daily, behind closed curtains, normalized by a culture that insisted, above all else, on privacy. Then came the 1970s, and with it, a tidal wave of change, fueled by the second-wave feminist movement. A simple, revolutionary idea began to spread like wildfire through consciousness-raising groups in church basements and community centers across the country. The personal is political. What happened to you alone in your home was not just your problem. It wasn't a personal failing, a sign of your weakness, or the price of a bad marriage. It was a shared experience, a systemic issue, a political crisis hiding in plain sight. For the first time, women were talking. Really talking. Not just about unequal pay or glass ceilings, but about the quiet terror that governed their lives. They shared stories of walking on eggshells, of being belittled until they felt worthless, of being isolated from friends and family, of being financially trapped, and yes, of being hit. As they spoke, a horrifying and validating pattern began to emerge from the static of individual shame. The private family matter was revealed to be a national epidemic. This revelation gave birth to the battered women's movement. It started small with grassroots activists, many of them survivors themselves, opening the first shelters. These weren't just buildings, they were life rafts. Places like the Haven House in California and the Women's Advocates Shelter in Minnesota became sanctuaries where the unspeakable could finally be spoken aloud. And as more stories were told, the language began to form. They didn't just talk about being hit. They talked about the constant fear, the psychological manipulation, the feeling of being erased. They were building a vocabulary of oppression from the ground up. The problem was the outside world, the police, the courts, the medical establishment didn't have this vocabulary. When a woman called the police, it was a domestic disturbance. Officers would arrive, tell the husband to walk it off, and leave the woman in a more dangerous situation than before. In the eyes of the law, what happened between a husband and wife was fundamentally different from an assault between strangers on the street. The marriage license was treated like a license for abuse. To break through this wall of indifference, activists and scholars needed a weapon the establishment would recognize: a diagnosis, a scientific framework. This is where psychologist Dr. Lenore Walker did her groundbreaking and controversial work. In the late 1970s, drawing from her extensive interviews with survivors, she coined a term that would change everything: battered woman syndrome. Walker proposed that women living in abusive relationships developed a specific psychological condition, a subcategory of post-traumatic stress disorder. Battered woman syndrome wasn't just about being sad or scared. It was a complex psychological state born from a specific terrifying pattern. She famously identified the cycle of abuse. First, the tension-building phase, a period of escalating dread and minor incidents. Second, the acute battering incident, the violent explosion. And third, the honeymoon phase, a period of calm, apologies, and promises that it would never happen again. This cycle, she argued, created a powerful psychological trap. The honeymoon phase provided just enough hope to keep the woman invested, while the constant threat of violence created a state of learned helplessness, a belief that escape was truly impossible. This was a seismic shift. For the first time, there was a clinical explanation for the question that had plagued and shamed survivors for generations. Why didn't you just leave? Battered woman syndrome explained that leaving wasn't a simple act of walking out the door. It was an attempt to escape a psychological prison, often at the moment of greatest danger. The syndrome became a legal tool, used in courtrooms to help juries understand the mindset of a woman who might fight back against her abuser, sometimes with lethal force. It medicalized her experience, translating the chaos of her life into a language the system could, at least in theory, understand. It gave a name to the invisible cage. But even this revolutionary concept had its limits, its dark side. The very name, battered woman syndrome, centered the physical violence. The word battered conjured images of bruises and broken bones. The psychological abuse, the insults, the isolation, the gaslighting, the control was seen merely as a component of the tension-building phase, a prelude to the real abuse of physical violence. It was not yet widely understood as a devastating form of abuse in its own right. The 1,000 cuts were still just the warning signs for the single explosive blow. Furthermore, the term syndrome was a double-edged sword. While it provided legitimacy, it also risked pathologizing the victim. It framed her as having a mental disorder, a syndrome, rather than having a logical, sane reaction to an insane, life-threatening situation. Critics would later argue that a woman's fear, her hypervigilance, her inability to leave, weren't symptoms of a broken mind. They were the survival skills of a prisoner of war. Nevertheless, the dam had broken. The battered women's movement, armed with the concept of a cycle of abuse and a clinical diagnosis, forced a national conversation. The fight for restraining orders, for funding, for shelters, for police training, it all stemmed from this fundamental reframing of domestic violence as a crime, not a private affair. They were dragging the monster out from under the bed and into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Society was being forced to look at the physical carnage that had been ignored for so long. The frontline activists, the counselors in the shelters, the women whispering their stories to each other. They knew the truth was deeper. They knew that a broken bone can heal. A bruise can fade, but the relentless, daily chipping away at a person's identity, their confidence, their very sense of reality, that was a different kind of wound. That was the architecture of control. The world was now beginning to recognize the fist, but it was still blind to the invisible weapons that did the most lasting damage. The battle to name the physical violence had been won, but the war to define the wounds of the mind was just beginning. The 80s dawned with a new kind of gloss. It was the decade of ambition, of power suits and Wall Street, of looking the part. Success was something you could see, a sharp car, a corner office, a perfect family photo. But beneath this polished veneer, a quiet, desperate revolution was taking place. It wasn't happening in the streets. It was happening in living rooms, in therapists' offices, and in the paperback racks of every bookstore in America. For the first time, the country was beginning to develop a lexicon for the soul's bruises. While the feminist movement had successfully dragged the horror of domestic violence into the light, its psychological twin remained a ghost. How do you fight an enemy you can't name? How do you heal a wound you've been told isn't real? This was the suffocating reality for millions. Their pain was dismissed as oversensitivity, their confusion as hysteria, their fear as simple marital discontent. They were told it was all in their heads, and in a cruel, twisted way it was. The abuse lived there, colonizing their thoughts, rewriting their sense of self. Then came the self-help boom. Books with titles like Women Who Love Too Much and The Cinderella Complex flew off the shelves. Daytime talk shows, once the domain of celebrity interviews and cooking segments, began hosting psychologists who spoke in plain, accessible language. They introduced a new vocabulary to the American public. Words like codependency, toxic relationships, and enabling started to enter the mainstream. And most importantly, the term emotional abuse was spoken aloud, not as a clinical diagnosis, but as a shared human experience. This was more than just a trend, it was an act of mass validation. For someone who had spent years being told they were the problem, hearing their secret reality described on national television was a life-altering revelation. The constant criticism, the deliberate misunderstandings, the silent treatment, the isolation. These weren't just personality quirks of a difficult partner. They were tactics. They were a pattern. They had a name. And giving something a name is the first step toward gaining power over it. It was the difference between drowning in a nameless sea and finally seeing the shoreline. But a cultural conversation is one thing. Institutional change is another. The legal system, built on a foundation of physical evidence, was utterly bewildered by the concept of psychological harm. A black eye could be photographed. A broken bone could be x-rayed. But how do you present a shattered sense of self-worth as evidence in court? How do you prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, the slow, methodical erosion of a person's reality? Throughout the 80s and into the early 90s, the system struggled. Custody battles were often lost by victims who were expertly painted as unstable or vindictive by their abusers. Divorce proceedings rarely accounted for the years of psychological torment. The law could see the fist, but it remained blind to the puppeteer's strings. Then in 1994, a landmark piece of legislation was passed. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. On its face, VAWA was primarily focused on physical violence, stalking, and sexual assault. It provided funding for shelters, created new legal protections, and streamlined the prosecution of these crimes. It didn't explicitly codify emotional abuse as a federal crime in the way we understand it today, but its impact was monumental. For the first time, the federal government made a powerful, unequivocal statement. What happens behind the closed doors of an American home is not a private family matter. It is a matter of public health, human rights, and federal law. It was a beachhead. It cracked the door open for a broader understanding of what domestic abuse truly entails. But while Washington was slowly grinding the gears of legislative change, a much faster, more radical revolution was starting to hum and crackle to life in homes across the country. It was the sound of a dial-up modem. The internet was arriving, and with it came the single greatest weapon against the tactics of mental abuse: community. To understand the power of this moment, you first have to understand the cornerstone of all psychological abuse: isolation. An abuser works like a cult leader, systematically cutting their victim off from friends, family, and outside perspectives until the abuser's voice is the only one they hear. Their reality becomes the only reality. In a world before the internet, this isolation was nearly absolute. A monitored phone line intercepted mail, a partner who tracks every mile on the car. There was no safe way to reach out, no way to check if your reality was sane. The internet smashed that isolation to pieces. In the anonymous, text-based world of Usenet groups, AOL chat rooms, and early message boards, victims found each other. They were no longer just a single terrified voice in a silent house. They were Survivor 1996 or Jane Doe Undercover 78, and they were talking to hundreds of others just like them. They tentatively shared their stories they had never spoken aloud to anyone. The crazy-making conversations, the gaslighting, the subtle threats, the financial control. And back came a chorus of replies that would change the course of their lives. That happened to me too. You are not crazy. That is abuse. 3 simple words. You are not crazy. For someone whose sanity has been systematically dismantled for years, that sentence is oxygen. It is a lifeline. It is the beginning of everything. These early digital communities became underground networks of support, validation, and information. People shared escape strategies, legal resources, and the new psychological language they were learning. The abuser's carefully constructed private reality was being invaded by a global consensus. The dynamic of he said, she said was collapsing under the weight of he said, they said. It was in these digital spaces that the vocabulary of abuse began to sharpen and evolve. One term in particular began to spread like wildfire. It came from a 1938 play and a 1944 film starring Ingrid Bergman, Gaslight. The term had lingered in psychiatric circles for decades, but it was online, among survivors, that it found its true power. It perfectly described that insidious, brain-twisting form of abuse where a perpetrator manipulates you into questioning your own memory, your perception, and your sanity. It was the perfect word for an experience that felt impossible to describe. And as the new millennium dawned, gaslighting began its journey from niche forum slang to a cornerstone of our modern understanding of mental abuse. Simultaneously, the field of psychology was making its own critical breakthrough. For decades, trauma was primarily understood through the lens of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, a condition associated with a single catastrophic event like a battle or a natural disaster. But that model didn't fit the experience of abuse survivors. Their trauma wasn't from one event, but from 1,000 tiny paper-cutting wounds inflicted over years. This led to the growing recognition of a different kind of injury, complex PTSD, or CPTSD. This concept acknowledged that prolonged, repeated trauma, especially within a relationship where escape is difficult or impossible, creates a different, more pervasive set of symptoms. It affects one's sense of self, their ability to form healthy relationships, and their core beliefs about the world. Finally, the science was catching up to the lived experience of survivors. The long-term damage of mental abuse wasn't just a feeling. It was a recognizable, diagnosable psychological injury. By the early 2000s, the foundation had been laid. The culture had a language. The law had taken its first tentative steps. And survivors, connected by a global network of wires and servers, had found their voice and their community. The invisible wounds now had names. The secret tactics now had labels. The lasting damage now had a diagnosis. The knowledge was no longer confined to academic journals or whispered conversations. It was organized, it was online, and it was ready to explode into the mainstream consciousness. All it needed was a new kind of platform, one that could turn a million scattered whispers into a single global roar. And that roar came not from a television network or a government report, but from our own pockets. The smartphone and the social media platforms it hosted became the great amplifier. Suddenly, the isolated forums and hidden blogs of the early 2000s were connected to a global town square. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr. These weren't just places to share vacation photos. They became digital sanctuaries and battlegrounds. The watershed moment, of course, was the #MeToo movement in 2017. While its initial focus was on sexual assault and harassment, its shockwaves cracked open a much wider conversation. The stories that poured out weren't just about single horrific events. They were about patterns of behavior. They were about the slow, insidious erosion of self-worth. They were about power dynamics that silenced and controlled. People began connecting the dots, realizing that the same person who committed a physical violation had often spent years creating the psychological prison that enabled it. #MeToo gave people a framework and, crucially, a sense of safety in numbers. It was a permission slip to speak. And from it, more specific conversations blossomed. Hashtags like #MaybeHeDoesn't went viral, becoming a masterclass in the nuances of emotional abuse, delivered in 140 characters. Each tweet was a tiny, devastatingly relatable scenario. Maybe he doesn't hit you, but he tells you that you're worthless and that no one else would ever want you. Maybe he doesn't hit you, but he monitors your phone and isolates you from your friends. For millions, reading these was like seeing their own secret diary broadcast to the world. It was a mass validation event. The profound gaslighting-induced confusion of "Am I crazy? Am I overreacting?" was met with a deafening chorus of "No, you're not. That happened to me too." The personal pain that had been atomized and privatized for centuries was suddenly collectivized. It was no longer just your problem. It was our problem. This new digital literacy gave us a shared vocabulary. Words that were once confined to psychology textbooks and therapy offices entered the public lexicon. Gaslighting became a household term, so much so that Merriam-Webster named it the 2022 word of the year. Narcissist, love bombing, trauma bond, hoovering. These concepts gave people the language to name their experiences, and naming something is the first step to understanding and escaping it. But this explosion of awareness was a double-edged sword. As the language of therapy went mainstream, it was inevitably diluted, misunderstood, and sometimes weaponized. Any disagreement could be labeled gaslighting. Anyone with a healthy ego could be branded a narcissist. The complex clinical meanings were flattened into social media buzzwords. This created a backlash, with critics arguing that we were pathologizing normal human conflict and creating a culture of hypersensitivity. And they had a point to an extent. The nuance was often lost in the algorithm. But to dismiss the entire movement because of its clumsy public adolescence would be to miss the point entirely. For every person who misused a term, there were 1,000 who finally found the word they desperately needed. The democratization of this language, for all its messiness, was a net positive. It armed people with the knowledge that their pain was real, that it had a name, and that it was a recognized form of harm. Today, we live in the world this revolution created. Therapy speak is everywhere. From TikTok therapists offering bite-sized insights to reality TV show contestants calmly identifying coercive control. This has done wonders for destigmatization. The idea that mental health is as important as physical health is more accepted than ever before. Resources from crisis hotlines to online therapy apps are more accessible than they have ever been in human history. Yet, our systems are still struggling to catch up to our consciousness. The legal frontier is perhaps the most critical battleground today. While physical domestic violence has been illegal for decades, the fight to criminalize coercive control, that pattern of intimidation, isolation, and degradation that constitutes the very soul of mental abuse, is still in its infancy in the United States. As of now, only a handful of states have laws that explicitly recognize it. This is the great disconnect. A survivor can now go online and find a global community that validates their experience, but then walk into a family courtroom and be met with a judge who sees no bruises and therefore sees no crime. They can be cross-examined by their abuser's attorney, who uses their newfound therapeutic language to paint them as unstable and vindictive. The very awareness that empowers survivors in their personal lives can be twisted and used against them in the systems that are supposed to protect them. And so the journey is far from over. The history of mental abuse awareness is not a straight line of progress. It's a messy, looping, ongoing struggle. It's a story of brave individuals fighting against institutions, of quiet whispers growing into a global roar, and of a society slowly, painfully learning to see the invisible. We have moved the conversation from the asylum to the clinic, from the courthouse to the kitchen table, and from the kitchen table to the global digital square. We have learned that the most profound wounds are not always the ones that bleed. We have learned that a person can be held captive without a single lock on the door. And what does this history mean for us right now? It means that the vague, unsettling feeling in your gut is a valid data point. It means that your perception of your own reality is worth defending. The central tactic of mental abuse has always been to sever you from your own intuition, to make you believe that you are the broken one, the crazy one, the one who is wrong. The entire arc of this history is the story of people reclaiming their right to say, "No, I know what I experienced. I know what is true." The fight for awareness was never just about laws or diagnoses. It was, and still is, a fight for the sanctity of the individual mind. It's about the radical act of trusting yourself in a world or a relationship that tells you not to. The work continues. It continues in state legislatures fighting for coercive control laws. It continues in therapy offices helping people rebuild their sense of self. It continues in the comment sections of social media, where one person's story becomes another person's lifeline. And it continues within each of us. By learning this history, by understanding the long, hard road it took for these ideas to even be speakable, we honor the millions who suffered in silence. And we arm ourselves for the future. We become better friends, better partners, better parents, and better citizens, capable of recognizing the subtle poisons of control and manipulation. We learn to build relationships and communities based not on power, but on mutual respect and emotional integrity. The journey from madness to manipulation, from hysteria to harm, has been a long one, but it has brought us here, to a moment of unprecedented understanding. The whispers have become a conversation. The conversation is becoming a movement, and the movement is slowly but surely changing the world. The single greatest victory in this entire struggle is the reclamation of one's own story, and that is a power that once gained can never truly be taken away.